Thank you, Marta. It's great to see such a big crowd today. I'd like to think that the planning of this session was completely calculated, but then it would sound as if we were coordinating things with the folks in Washington, which we didn't. This is just fortuitous timing. But very, very lucky to be able to have this conversation in the circumstances in which we're having this conversation today. I want to just start by keying off of what Marta had said at the beginning. A year ago, we talked about changes in fundamentals in the world. But when we had this conversation a year ago, there was a different government, still lame duck, but still a different government in the United States. That has changed. And so have the fundamentals in the world, politically and economically. So we want to first explore a little bit what's going on in the world, then a little bit how that affects Latin America pre the events of January 3rd, and then we will factor in what January 3rd may tell us or augur going forward, at least in the next year or so. So with that, I'll ask Jonathan to please start us off.
Sure. Well, anyway, thank you very much for all to come this morning. And it's a great crowd. And we are obviously here, it seems, as Ken has implied, at a particularly important juncture. It seems I say that every year, but maybe it's a bit more emphasized this year, particularly given the recent news out of Venezuela. But abstracting back from Venezuela for a moment, would like to talk about some of the global geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape and how that does set the backdrop for the discussions we'll have today. I want to make 3 points. The first is clearly the geopolitical landscape has changed, and let's just call it for what it is. The Pax Americana, which we can imbue with certain characteristics in our minds, but essentially the idea of the U.S. is an engaged global party with a sense of responsibility and accountability for that which takes place in the global forum. That Pax Americana is dead. America is currently seized with its own more parochial interests, sometimes referred to as America First, and that is the doctrinal posture of the administration. They've been very upfront about this, never more so than in the national security strategy that was issued quite recently and made reference actually to actions that we are probably going to be talking about later today. The second thing is China is trying, and I think, with greater levels of alacrity, to fill the vacuum. Their, quote, engineering state is a powerful machine, and that machine fills a lot of gaps, and it is seeking to not only fill the vacuum, but also to really to stand as a leader globally, and has increasingly developed the capabilities to do so. So it has led people to believe, and this is my third point, that there is a deep bifurcation or a bipolar nature of the global system. I don't think that's right, actually. I think it's much more of a fragmenting system where certain rules of the road are not followed, and so everybody's not knowing which side of the road to drive on, so there's collisions that happen. What I would say is actually there's a reason for this, and I think it's very important to identify this. The reason is that we have been essentially playing the same game for 40 years. And that game is that there's a huge interdependence between China and the United States, China and its proxies, and the United States and its proxies on global economics. The level of interoperability and integration around manufacturing, around the development of even the iPhone sitting in your pocket, 20% of which is China, is so deeply ingrained that to unwind such a thing could take a really long time and would cost a lot of money. And that sets the the landscape because we talk a lot. There's a lot of rhetoric around bifurcation and this and that, and there are restrictions and there are, references to high walls and small fences. But in the end, what actually makes the place go hasn't changed much, which is why the trade deficit between the United States and China is actually bigger than it was before, and exports from China to the United States are bigger than they were last year in 23, and in 24 grew again, and in 25 grew again. So that's the reality of what we can sometimes refer to as a bipolar, bifurcated world is not really that way at all. Of course, this has implications for LATAM, and just thought I would touch on a couple of those things, but I'll leave most of the material for later. But I do think just a couple of things that are really interesting about the world that I'm describing, that fragmenting world, and a world in particular driven by the U.S. looking at a much less broad global role and a very strong parochial set of concerns, also concerns in its own neighborhood. But that fragmentation brings about two things that are really good for LATAM. One, the dollar is depreciating and will continue to depreciate steadily. And that has really, like the 25% return in equity markets in LATAM was essentially a function of sort of looking the other way in terms of some economic, misfires, but really is the fact that the local currencies have strengthened significantly. It's true in Mexico, it's true in Brazil, it's true in Colombia in particular. The second thing I would say is it's a big commodity play. The commodity cycle is back. The commodity cycle is not driven by the same things it was before, the so-called super cycle that led to the BRICS and all that other nonsense. But it's actually a political economic cycle. So one, countries are much more apt to want to fight each other. And so armaments need base metals. Base metals are commodities. Second, and maybe more subtly, but very interestingly, it used to be that if you're a country in the global south, or if you're in a country that was in the middle powers, you wanted to accumulate as many US treasuries as you could because they're very, very fungible and they're always worth something. And you knew you could count on them. And so you'd use those in a period of crisis or emergency to buy the things you need, say to buy the commodities you need, oil, base metals, etc. Most countries today are skipping the step. They're just buying the commodities. They're buying gold, they're buying silver, they're buying oil. And the reason they're doing this is because what an ounce of silver buys today, which is 2.5 barrels of oil, used to be you'd need 4 ounces of silver. So this is disintermediation of a declining financial grip of the US. It's slow, let's be clear, but it is steady. And it is a really strong tailwind for commodities, and that's good for LATAM. I think we'll stop there.
Well, after being in this panel for 15, 16 years, one of the lessons I've learned is to not disagree with Jonathan, so I won't. But continuing along his train of thought, I think we're going through what for me is one of the toughest and most interesting periods in my career, in which my job is to provide answers, and to be honest, I can give more questions. I think a lot of the pillars that have anchored the way we think about the world, autonomous central banks, a rules-based system of globalization anchored by the Bretton Woods system, UN, etc., are all up in the air. A period of globalization means a period of supply chain optimizations. That means lower inflation, companies are cutting costs, prosperity globally is rising. All those things, I think, are now being questioned. Also, what Jonathan alluded to about the erosion of the value of the dollar, the hunt for commodities, that also means inflation. I think part of the reason why commodity prices tend to rise is also because currencies are falling. We're seeing countries spend more in weapons. We're seeing the aging of populations in the developed world. All those things also put pressures on fiscal issues. Those fiscal issues, I think, have two impacts. The first one is there's some inflationary dynamics there, but there's also another element that I think we're seeing now. Countries which are struggling with domestic issues tend to put their head in their sand and care less about, and are less thoughtful on what's happening globally. I think we're going through a period where those things are prevalent. And so this puts people whose job is to make predictions in a very difficult situation, because we have to question a lot of the assumptions that have driven our thought process for the past 30 or 40 years, and we have to think about the impacts. One of the surprises I've had this year, to be honest, is that North American countries have proven more resilient than I thought they would be. If you told me there's no USMCA, what's the corresponding growth rate for Canada or Mexico, I would have said anything with a minus and approaching a 5. I think both Canada and Mexico have proven quite resilient to the uncertainty surrounding NAFTA. That's encouraging. The erosion of central bank autonomy is concerning, but to be honest, I turned 25 before I lived in a country with an autonomous central bank, and I survived it. So I think there's reasons to be concerned, but there's also some perspective historically that we can go back to and say, well, it's less encouraging than it was, but there's reason to suggest that humanity will survive it. So I think this is one of those periods in time where we have to think about what the world looks like afterwards. What does the world in North America look like after Trump? Well, the honest answer is I don't know. But I think there's common grounds between the liberal capitalist democracies of the world that suggest that even if we move to a place beyond the Bretton Woods UN system, we probably have some form of anchor of cooperation, maybe some form of Paris Club 2.0, in which, again, echoing Jonathan's words earlier, we probably have the US with Australia, with Japan, with Korea cooperating on issues in Asia. We probably have Canada and the US, probably with Spain, which has very strong interest in the region, cooperating in LATAM. And I can do an advertising because I did not cooperate in the project, but I think that's one of the things that the report that the CCA sponsored does very well, that they think about the role of Canada in Latin America in a world where the rules of the game that we grew up with have changed. But I think it's one of those times in my career where, as I said earlier, I have more questions than answers. And I think it's one of those times where leaderships of companies, et cetera, have to be very flexible. We have to be very thoughtful about questioning the assumptions that have anchored our thought process over our careers. And with that, I will stop without having said much, but bring you more questions.
Great, Eduardo, thanks.
Can I just add an anecdote that
I'm coming to you anyway.
The bankers on the panel, they give you the Bay Street, Wall Street, Avenida Reforma. I'm the Main Street guy. So one anecdote, this is a real anecdote. About 10 years ago, a major US chemical company came to us because they had been sourcing all of their inputs from India and China. And they were concerned about, it was more geologistical risk. In other words, there's many things that could happen to those products coming out of the ports of India that are often clogged with strikes, et cetera, or even piracy in certain shipping routes, et cetera. And so we looked at equivalent suppliers in Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, and the pricing was so much higher in Latin America that they just couldn't reconcile the difference. No amount of risk that they were looking at the time could account for that big of a pricing difference. Well, they've just come back 10 years later because, as they put it, they no longer work in a world of one planet where they're sourcing from. They have to think about these politicized, maybe it's bifurcated, maybe if it's divided in further portions. That is going on all over the world. It is generally beneficial to Latin America that has the resources, but didn't have the scale, didn't have the efficiencies, didn't have the business environment to compete with a China. But it also, it bakes in structural inflation. The idea of us getting down to 1 or 2% inflation again in this new world, I think, is a dream. And so interest rates will remain high, and that's generally bad for emerging markets. But it also, with higher interest rates, you get the separation of the wheat from the chaff. The poorly run countries like Colombia versus the well-run countries like Paraguay. It forces emerging market leaders to be more attuned to global expectations of standards, of the legal certainty that they can provide investors and things like that. So in the long run, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly changes financial markets and it changes inflation expectations around the world.
Thanks, John. So Eric, if you could pick that up, the fundamentals that we've been talking about in a global scale.
Yeah, so it depends on what it is that we are looking at. So first of all, some of the fundamental shifts. Obviously, global trade, we have seen a complete overturning pretty much of the system that we have seen for the last 75 years with the post-World War II order. The U.S. now has the highest average tariff that it's had since the 1930s. You've seen countries that are major exporters to the U.S., including Canada and countries in Latin America, have to look at alternatives. One of the fastest growing fields in consulting is trade diversification because everybody's trying to get away from places. The other thing that is becoming a bigger deal, and we saw this with Prime Minister Carney and the imposition of steel safeguards, is that a lot of the product which used to be made in Asia and sent to the US isn't going there anymore. And so it's looking for homes. And so you're getting it sold on a discount in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, and in Canada. And what is happening is the local productive sectors are going to their government saying, you need to put safeguards in effect. And so the ramifications of having built a global trading system are still there, even as the realities of the trading system fragment. In addition, I think we have to differentiate the signal from the noise. So there was a great brouhaha when the former president, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, was sentenced for having supported efforts to overturn elections. And President Trump came out and said, Bolsonaro's my friend, you're getting a 50% tariff. And so then I went and I actually read the list of the products in the harmonized system codes. And what you find is that only 42% of Brazil's exports to the US are actually sanctioned because, wow, they don't want to put tariffs on orange juice. They don't want to put tariffs on mineral inputs that they need for the defense industrial base, and so on. Part of the reason why Canada has not suffered major upheavals with the USMCA, CUSMA, TMEC process and the tariffs that were imposed is because in March of 2025, it was agreed, namely Donald Trump declared that there would be an exemption of goods that were not otherwise tariffed that met USMCA, CUSMA origin requirements and could get into the market. A couple of other quick things when you look at the trends. Migration is a big deal everywhere. It's a big deal in Latin America, both on the receiving end and on the sending end, and some of perhaps the reactions of some of the more supportive leaders to the action in Venezuela we're seeing through that lens. You've also seen, obviously, in Europe, in the US, and so on, the rising of populism that's linked to migration. And so that's something that affects Latin America in a whole variety of ways. And then the last thing I'd mention is populism. Populism is generally bad for good governance. It is not pro-institutional. And if there's anything that we can say with a good amount of certainty is that good institutions give countries a longer survivability rate and a higher prosperity than the whims of one individual. And so populism is always out there. There are different parts of the world that are focused in that direction, but that is something that will continue to affect Latin America as it will affect many regions of the world.
Thank you, Eric. Solange, so let's bring the elephant in the room. Let's call it out. How is the incursion into Venezuela, in your mind, changed the calculus in Latin America, where Latin America, how it thinks about itself and where it may change where it thinks it sits in the world, or maybe doesn't change where it thinks it sits in the world?
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, what happened in Venezuela in January 3rd, I think, is it shows how the United States is thinking about the region. As we saw in November, there is a national security strategy. They said, well, the hemispheric is the Western Hemisphere is ours, so they are working on making that strategy a reality. So that's the first thing I see on this. But the second is, we have been thinking for a year that Donald Trump is not going to do what he says he is going to do. For 1 year, he has been saying, he has been talking about Venezuela. He started all these attacks in the sea against the ships. And he said, we will see, maybe we will see troops on the ground, boots on the ground. And most of the analysis we saw around in the media say, well, what's the probability is low. Some say medium low, but mostly they say low. And in the end, we saw it happen. Why? Because we have been thinking on Donald Trump on the or we have been trying to analyze Donald Trump on the logic of the economy, and I think that's something that we need to change. Yes, he has been putting the arguments, economic arguments before. He said about the oil, the companies, and everything. But in the end, it is about ideology. And he has been saying these things about Venezuela, about Greenland now. But it supports his idea of populism, but a populism linked to nationalistic narrative, which is recalling what Eric was saying. Yeah, it is very, I am very concerned about what is happening in the world about populism, but it is much more concerning when it is tied with nationalistic ideas or nationalistic narrative. Because this nationalistic narrative, this ideology is what is sustaining Donald Trump and many of Donald Trump colleagues in the White House, Miller, for example. So there is no logic in Venezuela. We saw the meeting with the oil companies and the CEO of Exxon afterwards. What happened there is that they said, well, yeah, it is possible to invest in Venezuela, but it will take a lot of time and a lot of money, and they might not be interested. So the economic argument doesn't sustain. So what is the logic? It is an ideologic narrative behind. So in the end, what I think in the case of Venezuela, it is just an example of what might be happening next. We need to think about Donald Trump as a populist nationalistic, and we need to try to analyze him before on his narrative and then use the economic arguments. Therefore, we will see that many of what he has been saying all these years in his first term and now in his second term are much more, not logic, but justified. That's my take.
Thank you very much, Solange. Gustavo, thanks for waiting so patiently. You sit in Brazil. Brazil is really sui generis, the size of Brazil, the diversification of its market, its abilities. It's less dependent on the United States. President Lula has been very clear about his thinking, at least for public consumption about the events on January 3rd. What is perception sitting in Brazil about how the Venezuelan incursion affects Brazil's position or its calculus as to how it wants to behave vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis the region?
Thanks for having me. Well, I think what happened on January 3rd is a real game changer in many ways. One is we talk about the fact that this is the first such intervention since the Noriega invasion in Panama. But more than that, it's an unprecedented move in South America. So when we talk about U.S. interventionism in Latin America, the U.S. usually was more direct in Central America and much less so in South America. So that is already something that for Brazilian policymakers has really raised red flags because it's just next door. So Brazil shares a 2,200 kilometer border with Venezuela. Now, I think it's also very concerning because of what happened in Venezuela. And I mean, and I'm not giving a pass in any way, shape, or form to the Maduro dictatorship, but what Trump is sending as a message is alignment rather than law is what will determine your fate. And I mean, this should be concerning for many heads of state in Latin America. Of course, Brazil, because of its size, because of its economy, it would be a much more complicated intervention in any way from the US, but we are going to have elections in October. And that is something that the Brazilian government is very much concerned about, how the MAGA movement will try to flood the zone in Brazil and try to fire hose public discourse with falsehoods, with fake news, and try to shape how voter behavior is going to happen. Now, the fact that Lula and Trump have had a good personal relationship makes any assumption more complicated at this point. But I mean, Marco Rubio and other policymakers in the US are close to the Brazilian far right. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. There is also the fact that Brazil, what happened in Venezuela goes against all tenets of Brazilian foreign policy. But at this point, Brazil doesn't have room to react more than offering a few words. Let's remember that the Trump's tariffs are still in place for industrial goods, and the U.S. is the #1 recipient of Brazilian industrial exports. So while we may say that a big chunk of Brazilian exports are exempt from the tariffs, it has been very punishing for the manufacturing sector in Brazil. They have shredded thousands and thousands of jobs since the tariffs came into effect in August. So I think, we're moving into a moment of deep uncertainty, and it's an election year, so that compounds with the uncertainty. So, I think we're heading to a very rocky 2026, and I mean it has been so for the past 2 weeks.
Thank you, Gustavo. We'll circle back on the when we talk about the electoral cycle, a little bit about what the implications may be in Brazil for this. And before I turn it over to Marta to take us through the next segment where we talk about Canada and Latin America, I just want to ask Jonathan if he wants to chime in on this subject.
Sure. I mean, look, we have a tendency, of course, to roll all these things up together. And if there's been a grievous shock in Venezuela, then our assumption is that things are going to be bad in Latin America. I really don't think that's the case. I actually think this event is quite bullish for the region. I'll tell you why. First of all, Maduro and the Venezuelan regime were just plain bad for the region. They're like a cancer on the entire region. I think that when you remove that, we will talk later as to whether that has been removed or not removed, or what the point, how to get from point A to point B to a more stable outcome of Venezuela later. But just in the meantime, I would say you've got some interesting upsides. The first is the removal of a very negative force in the region. Second, the reduction of burden on a number of countries that have kindly and quite impressively absorbed 8 million expat Venezuelans. But I mean, for a country like Peru to be able to begin to see 1.5 million people go back to their homes, I think would be a real relief, to be honest. Not to mention Colombia, of course, which has more than twice that. The second thing I would say is that for a country, not just Colombia, but for the whole area in the Andean region, I mean, that's where the reconstruction is going to come from. And right now, Colombia has 6% of its exports going to Venezuela. That's about $1 billion. Well, reconstruction is going to cost a lot more than $1 billion. So you could easily see that double almost overnight. I think that would be positive for the Colombian economy. And finally, there is the more parochial, but I think we're about to talk about politics. There will be, I think, as a result of this, an even greater willingness of electorates to lean right. You've already seen that in Chile. You've already seen that occur with caste. But I think that you're very much more likely to see more market friendly. They may be less friendly in other domains, but more market friendly people being elected in Peru, also being elected in Colombia. I'll let you handicap the outcomes for Espriella, but I would imagine his chances are better today, Abelardo. And even Porky Pig has got a pretty good chance, I think. So, all these things mean essentially a more market-friendly environment. And yes, sometimes there's these very unusual shocks that produce these shifts in Latin American politics, but it's a shift.
Can I just add something that Eric mentioned, but I think is really, really important? A lot of people misconstrue what happened in Mexico when they started to apply big tariffs on the Chinese as sort of an extension of U.S. policy. They were doing it to placate the Americans. The reality is they were doing it to placate Mexican industrialists. The trade deficit that Mexico has with China has ballooned over the last 10 years. And as Eric pointed out, with Chinese products being blocked out of the U.S. market, where are they dumping them? They're dumping them in middle-income markets around the world with whom they have a trade agreement, i.e. Latin America. We are going to see a lot more protectionist measures coming out of Latin America against the Chinese. And it's not necessarily going to be because Washington wants them to. It's because their own industrialists, their own manufacturers who are hurting in terms of their access to the U.S. market are far more threatened by cheap Chinese imports. And so this is going to be the year of protectionism against the Chinese, I believe, across several countries in Latin America, aided by this political shift to the right. But again, it's more of a coincidence. It's not necessarily that the Americans foresaw this, but the Chinese, remember what keeps China, the great contract in China is, I will put up with a lack of political freedom if you make sure that my children have a better economic life than I had. That's the contract with the Communist Party in China. If you can't deliver on that, if you can't deliver full employment, then trouble happens. And right now, they're getting blocked out of the U.S. market. The Europeans are becoming more protectionist against the Chinese. Their ability to keep their economy based on exports is going to shrink. And of course, the rest of their economy domestically was driven by huge levels of debt, which they can't afford either. So the Chinese have to keep their factories humming if they want to keep political stability. And that means pushing products around the world, and the world is going to stand up to that, I believe, over the next 12 months. And that's going to be a whole different dynamic.
Thanks, John. I'm going to actually jump off of what you just started talking about and switch the conversation a little bit more toward trade and focused a little bit more on Canada. We'd like to sort of start a conversation on how Canada can confront these new fundamentals, and particularly as it relates to the region. So I'm going to ask Gustavo actually to join us from Brazil, because one of the things that's under conversation and in the works right now for Canada is the Canada-Mercosur trade agreement. Gustavo, could I get your comments on how that's being viewed in Brazil? And then we'll come back into the room to John to speak about a Canadian perspective.
Sure. So we were talking about with someone in the Lula administration last week, and word is that yes, Brazil, especially with what has happened in terms of our relations with the U.S., we need to diversify, and the best way to do so is to open up the economy and do trade deals with other countries. Let's remember that Brazil and Argentina are the closest economies in the G20. Brazil is a very insular economy. And I mean, if the Mercosur EU deal really gets done, and I mean, it has been 26 years in the making, I'll believe it when I see the first duty-free ships arriving at the Santos airport. But now for the Brazilian government, there are two big priorities. One is to expand trade with India, but also get over the hump our negotiations with Canada for a trade deal, Mercosur Canada trade deal. According to Apex Brazil, which is Brazil's trade promotion agency, there are 11 key sectors in Brazil that would benefit from that. The biggest one being agriculture and foodstuffs, but also healthcare, sectors of the creative economy, such as audiovisual industry, electronic games, and also in the technology, information and technology sector. So that is a big priority for Brazil's Vice President, Geraldo Alckmin, who is also our industry and trade minister. And his office hopes that we will get that deal inked on paper still this year.
Great. John, can you?
Sure. At first glance, you might think, why is Canada bothering with Mercosur, and why is Mercosur bothering with Canada? I mean, trade agreements traditionally are looked through the prism of complementarianism. In other words, I export stuff that you tend to import, you export stuff that I tend to import. And so that's why Latin America doesn't really trade with itself, but it trades with China, it trades with the United States, it trades with Western Europe. But here's where, and this ties directly to the white paper, is where we have to rethink trade. Because the reason Canada wants free trade with Brazil, or ought to be thinking at least this way, we have massive industries in Canada that support our mining industry and support our energy industry, services, technology, niche services. And they need a bigger playing field to expand. So if you're an engineering geomapping company, you need other mining jurisdictions to sell that to. And so the ability to link with a huge mining economy like Brazil's opens up massive opportunities for very high paying, good jobs in Canada. The same goes for the oil and gas industry. Canada is a world leader when it comes to gas distribution and storage technologies. And Brazil is a massive potential market for natural gas, domestic natural gas expansion. The other is that free trade agreements provide rules that protect both the exporters that sell into a market and the investors. I remember in the early days of NAFTA when I lived in Mexico, Mexican companies were complaining because when they set up a factory in northern Mexico, the guys from CFE, the electricity, they would come around and ask for their bribe. And then the water guy would come around and ask for his bribe. And everybody who sort of you needed to connect with any utility, they would ask for a bribe. And suddenly they were doubling their bribes on the Mexican manufacturers. And they're like, why? Well, we can't charge the gringos now because they have a free trade agreement with Mexico, and they're calling up our, Minister of the Interior and Minister of the Economy, and that's trickling down to us, and we're not allowed to touch them anymore. So there's a whole legal framework. When you operate in a legal environment like Latin America, where, let's face it, the legal protections against things like sort of retail level corruption are not there, they provide some teeth to protect you. And so those are two really compelling reasons that people might not think of as top of mind as to why you would sign a trade agreement with an economy that has many of the same strengths that Canada has. They produce many of the goods, commodities they produce. They have an aerospace industry. We have an aerospace industry. There's a lot of things that we compete with them on. But when you look at the service and technology fields that support our strong industries, Brazil needs those things. And that's the opportunity.
Thanks, John. I'm going to actually jump a little bit ahead and move on to CUSMA and invite Eric to start speaking to us.
So we're in a very interesting year. We ended last year with, okay, I could start rapping, but I don't. So we ended last year with the U.S. trade representative saying, I don't know, USMCA, as they call it in the U.S., could go away. It could become bilateral. We don't know. So this is the year of great uncertainty. The formal process is that by July 1st, 2026, there is supposed to be a decision about whether or not to renew the agreement for another 16 years. If the agreement is not renewed, then it goes into a series of annual review cycles that will go over the next 10 years. And there's a lot of discussion about, well, will this be a renegotiation, a review? What will happen? At the same time, you've also had the US government pursuing bilateral agreements with Mexico and especially with Canada. And there's been no explanation about how those bilateral agreements relate to the trilateral agreement. And as was famously seen in October, Ronald Reagan sunk the bilateral negotiations, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion between the US and Canada in a formal sense since that time. And so Canada enters the new year with a new ambassador and with a process that it doesn't know what it's going to deal with. Now, it is absolutely fundamental for Canada to have a number of things. One, the agreement needs to be trilateral, because when you read the rules of origin and you look at how the production structures work, it's very difficult for the US and Canada to make a car when, on average, Mexico accounts for 45% of an originating North American vehicle by content. And there are also cases where Mexico needs Canada in a very similar type of way. So you need the trilateral agreement for production structures not to get completely blown up. That's one reason. You also, Canada needs to have some sort of a framework in place that will manage its relations with the US. Donald Trump likes to move the chess pieces around, to change things up whenever he wants as a way of trying to keep his opponents off balance. We need to, as part of what Jonathan talked about earlier, we need to start thinking about the world less in terms of friends and allies, as we thought about in the post-World War II period, and to think about counterparties. Everything is a negotiation. I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just we are in a world where counterparties are how the leading powers tend to look at this. And so Canada needs to find a strategy for ensuring the survival of free trade with the US. It needs to ensure that that exemption doesn't go away. But ultimately, as we sit here at the start of the year, I can only turn to the words of America's greatest poet, Taylor Swift, who says, it's going to be forever or it's going to go down in flames.
Fabulous. So I actually want to turn it back over to Jonathan, if I could, because while trade treaties, we understand trade treaties are important, they're necessary, they're a scaffolding for how and what you can do, and how you can build relations. Are they enough? Like what can be changed, and what should Canada be looking to do, and how to engage in the region, and what strategies would you sort of highlight with that? So what's the next step beyond trade treaty?
Sure. Well, I think you ask a very apposite question, because I'm not a sorcerer, so I don't know what the 26 is going to bring, but I think understanding the mode of the White House and how it operates, you have to have realistic expectations as to how cut and dried and how black and white the CUSMA process is going to be. Up to this point, the evidence seemed to argue for something that's a bit more improvised. And so, Eric was talking about a series of annual reviews, which gives the administration time and effort to create sectoral pressures and ultimately suiting what seems to be an America First approach to bringing more of these activities to the United States. Cars, steel, for example, and really not very logically aluminum. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about other things we can do. I would also just make the point that the worst case scenario, which I think we need to talk about, the worst case scenario is a withdrawal. I don't think that'll happen. There's way too much consensus in Congress for that. But really the worst case scenario is what the analysts refer to as a zombie deal, which is to say that nothing happens, that we continue in the current rut that we're in, neither fish nor fowl, neither on nor off. And I think that there's a reasonable chance of that occurring. All is the preface to my answer to your question. We in Canada, and this picks up very much up from what John was saying previously, we need to do a massive mind shift in terms of how we think about our economic relationships with the Americas. When we have thought about it in the past, it's been about got 'em, need 'em, and as a result, people thought, I think foolishly, that there was not really a lot of scope for filling in, if you will, the free trade agreements we've had with many, many countries in Latin America, Chile, not just Mexico, but Chile and Peru and others. The next 5 years is going to be about how Canada starts to behave less like the United States and more like Japan and more like Korea, countries that have suffered from issues of access and issues of economic relevance because they weren't next door to a super huge economy that just loves to engorge itself on consumer items. So what they have done and what we think, and you'll read about this in the paper, Eric's chapters in particular, are strategies that we indulge in the same kind of more sophisticated industrial policy to make sure that when we are building, we are not only building in Canada, which we absolutely need to do, but we're also using the purchase that our companies have in Latin America, particularly in areas of mining, but other areas too, infrastructure, energy, and drawing in through those supply chains Canadian players that have an economic stake in the successful completion of projects in Latin America. There are examples of this. A Canadian company built the Quito airport, Aecon. But did it have the support and the ecosystem to bring all of the different aspects of that project from Canadian small and medium-sized providers? Probably not. Actually, I know they didn't. I know the deal well. But if we had a policy set of levers that encouraged that, we would have a very similar approach than the Koreans have, as they ensure that their large companies are able to bring along the small and medium-sized companies that supply them in their international efforts. So it's a different mindset. It is more of looking at the verticals, the things in which we are good, the things that we know a lot about, and really think about building our relationships in Latin America the same way in 1965 we started to build our relationships in the auto sector between Canada and the United States. Because the analogy is true. Right now, if you are an OEM in Ontario and you're part of a trilateral auto production ecosystem, you're bringing in somewhere between 50 and 80 other companies located everywhere from Windsor to St. Hyacinthe to produce that car. And that's what we want to do. Main industries that we feel we have purchase in, of which there are many, I might say, in Latin America.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan obviously was referring to the paper, that our strategy paper, which you all have. Okay. Jonathan was setting it up for an introduction to the strategy paper that everybody in the room has. Those online can read it in any of or all of 4 languages at ccacanada.com. But before we move into the business political outlook in select countries where the elections are coming up and the like, maybe we should pause for a second for questions from folks online or anybody in the room. Please.
Hello? Yes. My name is Jaime Dibaki. I'm with the Toronto Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Question about Brazil and Canada. And as for John and I guess Gustavo, at the IEFA International Forum for the Americas back in the fall, we had the Ambassador Carlos Frankel from Brazil sharing his optimism of the technology that Brazil produces and is actually exporting to Canada. He mentioned the example of small planes designed in Brazil that assemble with engines from Montreal and are assembled in London, Ontario. And obviously he was encouraging the chambers of commerce to work around other opportunities, for example, data centers. So question for John and I guess Gustavo. John said that there may be opportunities in Brazil to take more technology from Canada, and that was an example that the ambassador said, well, Brazil has its own technology to export as well. So I wonder if both of you could comment on that.
I think Gustavo might know more particulars around specific technology, but absolutely. I mean, the Brazilians in areas like e-commerce, digital finance, certainly around the resource sectors, have specific technologies that have global applications, definitely.
Yeah, no, in terms of, so Brazil has been increasing its trade relations with Canada. We went since 2022 from 11th source of imports to Canada to 9th place. And I mean, a big chunk of that are airplanes and airplane parts, but also semi-finished iron and steel products. Similarly to what happened between Brazil and the US, we are big suppliers of intermediate goods for Canadian industries.
Oh, yeah, thanks. The reason as why Canada has such a potential in markets such as Brazil is because of the fact that even though we have the same industries, Canada has a lot to offer in terms of technology and also services to a country such as Brazil. Without being provided, regarding Venezuela, Trump has said that the Venezuela, after Maduro, basically is going to be one where the oil industry is going to be controlled in 100% by the United States. And that's not the most important part, but the most important part, as I saw it, is the fact that whatever dividends the Venezuelan people will have from oil will actually will have to be spent also in American products and services. So with that being said, what would it be what the panel would foresee in terms of our relationship from Canada to Venezuela in the Venezuela after Maduro in terms of trading?
It's a great point, and we actually, I know that in the interest of time, we sort of skipped over this, but very quickly, this is a real threat to Canadian wheat sales to Venezuela. Right now, Canada controls about 50% of the Venezuelan wheat market. The Americans have a little under 30%, and there's a good chance that because of this political pressure, that they'll be forced to buy American wheat over Canadian wheat. There are cases around the region where I think you will see this kind of political pressure. In Panama, I could see this happening. I could see it happening in other jurisdictions, El Salvador, et cetera, where the Americans try to pressure not only don't buy Chinese, but buy our products versus others. But for every one of those, I think there's plenty of opportunities and there's plenty of markets where Brazil, Peru, Chile, Argentina, where they may say out of one side of their mouth, things to placate Washington, but deep down inside, there's a deep resentment of that American pressure. And so they will do what they can to diversify their service providers and their vendors that they buy from abroad. So I think one has to go beyond the headlines and country by country and industry by industry. It's very difficult to make blanket statements, but this is where you have this sort of two-faced diplomacy, where you say one thing to keep Washington at bay, but you act differently to fulfill your own sort of sentiments. And also, they have voters they have to take care of. And we've seen that if you push too hard, Lula, who was deeply unpopular 6 months ago, is less unpopular precisely because of Trump. And Trump's pressure in Colombia could help the leftist candidate, if they choose another idiot on the right to run against the left, we may see more, of left-wing politics in Colombia. Not because voters really want that, but because they resent American interference, and because Colombia has a very unusual selection process for its final candidates that can often result in a Hernandez-type sonso as your candidate. And so this is where American interference can only be so effective and can actually cause a backlash.
One thing, if I may, Marta, one thing that is emphasized strongly in the Beyond the Build paper that you have with you is there is a different offering when you are coming from Canada. And I don't think we can discount, particularly in the current environment and based on John's comments, which I agree with, that the ability to diversify one's energy services, mining services, all of those things that I was referring to earlier that go along with main industries in which we have real purpose, more purpose on absolute basis, by the way, than the United States as it relates to mining. That cultural difference, that different brand, if you will, is an asset. And I think sometimes we forget that because we've taken it grotesquely for granted. And now we need to start using it because it is actually a point of distinction, a point of differentiation, which will make Canadian providers more competitive.
Eduardo had a comment he wanted to make here.
And Solange as well, yeah. I just want to point out that John's use of the word idiot was really in the very strictest political scientific terms, right?
And in every period of transition, there's always going to be blow-ups and pitfalls and mines along the way. But one of the things I think we have to bear in mind that is that eventually gravity pulls the apple to the ground. And that's what I mentioned about the common interests on liberal capitalist democracies will eventually form a natural alliance. They will have interests that pull them back. That's actually how we're thinking about the the process of USMCA. A good friend of mine essentially put all the sector and company specific documents from the consultations on the US, Canada, and Mexico and put them into a blender, and then they cross-reference that with AI algorithms that use social media and they use interviews, etc. And I think the inevitability of a North American integrated market is there. If you look at the interest of specific Congress people, of the governors across the U.S., NAFTA will endure. And I think the natural partnership between Canada and the U.S. is there. I think that was one of the reasons why the early rhetoric from the U.S. Against NAFTA partners was probably stronger than now, why some of the sectors, and it was alluded about Brazil's reality with the U.S., that they're taxing things that don't hurt American consumers. Well, reality is that a lot of these countries have a natural partnership that will be affected if reality is ignored. And so we have to survive the transition process. But we will eventually get back to some system, whether it's still the Bretton Woods UN system that endures or something else. It could be a Paris Club 2.0, but there is a natural partnership and that will come back once we go through this period of friction.
And can I add just one small point, because someone talked about Brazil and the Lula's popularity, and if I may, I'll be really brief, but I think I wouldn't say that because of Trump, Lula got his popularity back, but I think that it did jolt the government into life. But I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that food inflation also went really down over the past few months, and this is like something that really affect poor families in Brazil, which are the majority of families. Food inflation went from like almost 8% in July to less than 3% now, and that it has a big plays a big role in presidential popularity in Brazil. I'm sorry, just wanted to add this.
Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly, seeing from another perspective, the influence of Trump's narrative, I think, is having an influence on the right in many of the Latin American countries. So I'm not quite sure that it will join or help the anti-American sentiment as in all the countries. I completely agree with John that we need to analyze country by country, because, for example, in the case of Mexico, we can see an opposition on mostly on the center, but more on the right, turning in pro-Trump narrative. Because of the economic results against the Morena government, etc. But we can see this movement and this opposition growing. We can see this also what happened in Honduras, maybe with Chile. So there are some movements in the right happening in the Latin American region that are not just all against Trump narrative, but pro narrative of Trump.
One thing, though, I think it's critical to keep in mind is that we don't know what Venezuela is going to look like. You had the removal of the leader, and then the system has evolved. And Venezuela seems to me as uninvestable today as it was a month ago. And so we will have to see where that goes. The other thing that's essential to keep in mind is that despite the national security strategy and so on, the U.S. attention span for long-term structural matters is not necessarily demonstrated. We saw during the summer, the U.S. bombed Iran, and they quickly said, "Oh, not going to do that again. Achieved our goals." You had Secretary Rubio said, "Don't see the need for any more action in Venezuela." And so, yes, there's the blockades. That's obviously a big deal if you're in the oil industry. But at some point, if the U.S. is in a position where it could be the boy who cries wolf, because if you're threatening everyone at all times, then people begin to wonder. They have a discount factor associated, but they begin to wonder, are you really going to carry through on certain things? So I think we just don't know, but I think we can assume that the Trump administration's attention span for any one thing at a given period of time is not that great, especially because this is a government run by people rather than institutions, and people don't have a deep bench behind them.
Yeah, I just to add to that, I think segue to the next and the last section we want to get into on political outlook is, and it goes to the applying what Eric just said to an earlier comment on the panel about the potential shift to the right. I think it's a country by country analysis, and we don't know how this Venezuela thing is going to turn out, and it depending on the outcome, it could play out politically in very different ways, right? And you could see this, and we'll get to Colombia in a few minutes and talk about how that could effectively turn a populace against the right, particularly in Colombia, because of the ramifications of a Venezuelan situation gone even worse, where there's no control on the border or it becomes more porous. You could see that could have very different political dynamic than something that's considered to be a successful operation in minimalizing somebody or taking out of Venezuela somebody who the vast majority of Colombians, pretty much even on the left, although not completely, thought was a bad guy. But depending on how Venezuela plays out, that sentiment may shift. But I think with that, maybe we should go to our last section on political fortunes in the year ahead. We're going to focus on the several jurisdictions that have elections coming up and a couple others that just had elections, or areas that we may not have spoken about, just so we can give a quick, at least some treatment of them. So why don't we start with Brazil, since we talked about Brazil a fair amount. Gustavo, do you want to start with how you think the political situation in Brazil is going to play out over this year? Elections are coming up in the fall.
Right. So, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that it seems pretty, the scenario looks at this point very favorable for Lula, because one, in Brazil, we have a massive incumbent bias. I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that tens of millions of people depend on the government to make ends meet in terms of pensions or social policies, welfare policies. And I think like that's pretty much the only reason why the last presidential election was so close, because Bolsonaro was the least popular incumbent to try re-election, and he almost won the race. It took Lula, who is the most popular politician in Brazilian history, and a coalition that went from like Trotskyist communists to center-right liberals. And so I mean, he won by a whisker. Now that you have like a government that we can like it, we can hate it, but that seems really organized in helping the president to pursue re-election, and we have an opposition in tatters. I mean, Jair Bolsonaro is in prison. Even if he gets a sentence reduction, he will not be on the ballot in October. His eldest son, Flávio Bolsonaro, is trying to present himself as his political heir, but charisma is not transferable. So I think that bearing the Bolsonaro name will allow Flávio Bolsonaro to be the best performing conservative in the presidential race, maybe even go to a runoff stage, but I don't see him beating Lula. Now, when we look at the congressional elections, I think that we may see a Congress that is at least as conservative as the one we have, but probably even more conservative. We have this group of parties that we call the Big Center, which are actually right of center parties, conservative parties, but who are fluid, ideologically fluid, and they can lend their support to any government depending on the price. They are, because of this Lula versus the Bolsonaro family dynamic, they seem to be shifting their attention to the congressional races, and they have, because of their big benches, they have the lion's share of Brazil's public fund to finance the partisan fund to finance elections. So I would expect Lula to win the election, but have to deal with an even more conservative Congress in the years forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd like to just add a few things that I think are notable. Lula's a very old guy, but he's still pretty sharp, I have to say. He's done some very, very brilliant political maneuvering. So maybe he deserves to win, frankly. First, he's managed Trump as expertly as any leader in the world. He has not bowed and scraped like certain leaders we could look at in Europe. He's managed to somehow turn what was really a conflagration into a friendship. He said the right things about Maduro. I think he sees the long game here, knowing that most, as I think was mentioned, most people in Brazil probably think Maduro is a monster. And the economy is working for him. I mean, the Brazilian economy is muted, I think, but it's certainly going to eke out 2+ growth in 2026. ECB is probably going to cut to 12.5, probably leave it there. Inflation is, for the first time in the last reading, actually within the bound of the inflation targeting regime of 4.4%, even though on the year it'll be 6%. And unemployment is relatively low at 5.5%. So, I mean, things are actually not that bad. But I think the thing that really is remarkable is just how entrenched a Jair Bolsonaro blessing is for anyone who runs against Lula. And that's essentially that's what causes the fragmentation. And I think it would really, I emphasize what Gustavo was saying, it's just, they won't be able to get their act together. Even if Flavio was like, Jerry Seinfeld, I don't think it would make much difference, because it's still, the right is fragmented. There are two other players who feel that they've got a shot. This guy from Guayas, and I think that if it's going to be, you have to get blessed by Bolsonaro. I think that it's a structural weakness for the right. So I think it's Lula's to lose, and maybe it goes to a second round. I agree, but I think that's where we're going.
I'm going to jump and move on to Argentina. John, can I get you to comment on Argentina?
Sure. It's amazing. And the parallels, of course, for the United States are interesting, but there's also key differences. And that is that, this guy comes to power. He seems like a lunatic. But what's different from him versus Trump is he surrounds himself with incredibly competent people. So you've got Milei sort of doing his daily political act, where he literally, much like AMLO did, every day has a press conference and he talks about what was achieved in the last 24 hours. So he's keeping the street happy. Meanwhile, he's got these very competent technocrats who are actually doing the work to change, to reform the economy, to open it up to foreign investment, to take away many of the sort of, to use a Brazilian term, custo argentino, all of these internal taxes and inefficiencies that really kept the economy back. And it was all designed because his party only had about 15% of the seats. So he relied on the street supporting him, because if he lost support from the street, then the judges would turn against him, the provincial governors would turn against him, and the other parties who supported him issue by issue would turn against him. Fast forward 2 years, the party wins, not completely, but has enough votes now between their own party and very like-minded parties that they can now govern and get the votes. And now we're going to see him cementing the more, you know, a stronger, deeper reform agenda. And what began was, you know, financial investors coming in and making a ton of money off this very high interest rates while inflation was declining. Now we're going to see the investment in the internal economy, in the peso generating economy. First of all, dollar generating exports, but also the domestic economy. And so that's the investment that's needed, because that's the investment that generates jobs. And by cutting the government spending as much as he did, a lot of people were put out of work without the kind of social safety net that we might find in other places around the world. And so they're working against the clock to convince strategic investors to invest, not just in the oil patch and mining, but in the internal economy. And that's where I think there's still room for a lot of uncertainty as to whether this experiment will work. But the midterms were the first really big test, and he passed it with flying colors. And what's really interesting about Milei is that the next government in Chile, the next government in Colombia, the next government in Peru cannot ignore the success of these libertarian politics. And instead, everywhere across Latin America, they have huge fiscal deficits. COVID eroded all the fiscal strength in Latin America. But the solution for the last 15, 20 years was raise taxes. Well, now we have an alternative to that, which is cut costs. And so I think Milei is very interesting because his policies may be emulated in these next governments across South America in particular.
Gustavo, can I ask you to comment on Argentina as well?
Sure. No, I think one thing that is interesting about Milei and Argentina is that after a kind of tough 2025, he's once again in a comfortable position since the midterm elections victory for his coalition, because of the U.S. bailout allowed him to stabilize the economy in a moment where investors were starting to doubt the long-term sustainability of Argentinian bonds. And
Okay, well, while he tries to get back on, can I add something? Gustavo was talking about that, and just a brief comment about Argentina and Milei, because I think it is related to Trump's relation too. Many people in Argentina saw the loan from Trump and the support from Trump as something positive. So it helps a lot Milei's approval ratings in Argentina.
can you hear me?
Not all the people, not even all the voters from Milei were completely happy with Milei, but after the announcement of that loan and after some of the statements from Trump, we can see the change of the approval. So it is also interesting how many of the countries in Latin America and the governments are relating to Trump to gain more approval on their own elections.
Gustavo, you're back. Did you want to finish up what you said? You got cut off halfway.
Yes, no, sorry. The joys of living in São Paulo is that from time to time, during summertime, we have energy problems. Another one now, just we got cut off electricity. But just to say that one major uncertainty point about Milei in the near term future is that Argentina is still not generating its own dollars to pay off its debt. So the long-term concerns about this economy, they are still there, and Milei is hoping that with a stronger Congress, he will pass pro-market reforms such as labor reforms, which is his priority after the summer recess. But I mean, it's still unsure how attractive he will be able to make Argentina for investors. And I mean, at the moment, Argentina continues to depend strongly on credit, and his insistence in the crawling peg system is popular in the short term, but can be really costly and expensive in the long term. So I think there are still some. I think the jury's still out on how much of a success the Malay experience will be in Argentina.
Okay. So, John, can you kick us off on Chile?
I have about 100 cousins in Chile. Half of them are Allendistas and half of them are Pinochetistas. Believe it or not, families in Chile are still divided that way. And I always laugh with my Chilean friends because, you know, by their measurement, California with its public universities and public highways is a communist state. So you have to take a grain of salt when a Chilean talks to you about sort of politics and what's right and what's left and what's reasonable. But I think that Boric made a very good impression actually in a luncheon that we hosted for him several years ago. And generally in the international circles, he was seen as a pretty pragmatic guy. But Chileans weren't so much critical of him as much as some of the people around him who were pursuing a much more, I would call it sort of an idealistic and naive agenda as opposed to a really, you know, anti-business agenda. And what we're seeing is caste represents a kind of a vote. The Chileans are, in my mind, along with the Uruguayans, the most pragmatic voters, the least likely to be driven by populism in all of Latin America. And so to me, in many ways, caste is being misrepresented by the international press as this far right candidate. He's like a, you know, the old fashioned Republicans. He's sort of a, you know, he's a pretty pragmatic guy. And Chile is also a very advanced society in terms of what the society's expectations are around environmental issues, around education. They're further up in the hierarchy, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can't sell them easily with a populist rhetoric. So I think that what has happened with the Boric administration, a lot of money, and I have a lot of friends in Miami who made a lot of money, private banking Chileans who brought their money out of Chile over the last 4 years. You're going to see a return of a lot of that money back to Chile. Chile has some serious issues. It's become way too, much like Canada, it's become way too overburdened with regulations, permitting, et cetera. It's almost impossible to be a junior miner in Chile today. And that's why the mines end up being bigger and bigger and bigger in scale, because you need the hurdle costs of getting a mine started, the permitting costs, over 200 permits to get a mine started, are huge. And so the mines tend to be bigger and therefore more disruptive. It's like their own worst enemy. But I see caste bringing a level of pragmatism that is going to usher in a lot of Chilean money back into the country. And so you're going to see a strengthening of the currency. They're very well positioned for the future of the energy transition and the future of our high-tech industries, in that they have copper and they have lithium, which is what those industries need. And so I'm very bullish on Chile. But I do see a lot of work needed at the sort of regulatory level and the legislative level to follow up on the promise to make Chile more business friendly.
Okay, in the interest of time, did anyone want to say something very quick on Chile to add to John? No? Okay, then we will move on to Colombia. I'm going to actually invite Ken, my co-moderator, to start us off on Colombia, please.
I'll try and be brief, which I always say when I start talking about Colombia. Yeah, okay. I'll try and be brief on Colombia, which is what I always say, and it ends up being the longest dissertation of the day, but I'm going to try and do that. I just came back 3 weeks, and I was there, including when the events of January 3rd happened in Venezuela. So they got a sense of a bit of what Colombians think about that. But there are several impressions. One is the shame of it is what's become a big issue in Colombia again is security. And that was something that the electoral system just couldn't shake for forever, essentially. And it did manage to over the last couple of cycles where security wasn't the main issue. But it is again now. And security, when security gets on the ballot, then you tend to, I think it tends to be a bit of a polarizing topic. I think certain assumptions are made about which side of the, or where in the political spectrum can deal with these issues better, security issues. And I think that absolutely is and has entered into this cycle of of Colombian politics. The way this is stacking up now is the Colombian polls are, not usually terribly accurate, but the numbers are the candidate on the left, which would basically be the standard bearer of Petro's movement, is polling anywhere to 28 to 30%, whatever, depending on the day and the poll. And he would be considered to be, as I say, further out on the left, maybe more ideological than Petro, perhaps some might say. I don't know that it really matters, but that's where he stands. And then second place, only a few points behind, is Abelardo de Espriella, who is a perfect definition of a right-wing populist, and who's actually has a background being an attorney for Alex Saab, other folks involved with very, very unsavory underworld kinds of activities. And I could say he's to the right of Alvaro Uribe, let's put it that way. For those who know a bit about Colombia, that's saying a bit. Then what you have in the center, which is always the perennial ideas, can the center come through? Because well over 40% of Colombians identify themselves as centrist. If you ask them, in the polls, it seemed to be consistent, but it never seems to quite show up when election time comes around. And we can have discussions as because why that is, because they don't have the proper candidates or enough to galvanize the support, or when things start to get polarized, they'll go from one end to the other, whatever it is. But in the center now, there's Sergio Fajardo, who's polling third, who just in the most recent poll was 9 and change percent, maybe. I don't think he broken 10. In the past he has, but he seems to be at that level now. And then you have this huge center that of 7, 8 candidates. I lost track there were originally over 100 candidates, but this is what we're getting down to, of folks that classify themselves as centrist. They would be anywhere from center right to center right. And they will go to a primary election in March, and the winner of that will go forward and carry that. Now, the idea would be is if people don't want one end or the other of the spectrum, and plenty of Colombians are not pleased with that, as you can tell just by the numbers that I gave there. If you add 28 and 26, you get whatever number you get. There's close to 40 some odd, 45, 46% who aren't really pleased with either of those, at least at this point. The question is, what comes through the center? And when people ask, is it possible for someone from the center, however you want to define the center, the answer is always, well, it's a mathematics game. And the question is, if someone other than someone from that center gets to the second round, it could be very possible for someone from the center to win the second round. The question is getting to the second round. And the polls have consistently showed, although I'm not sure I checked the last one, but the person now who has the best chance of winning in the second round would be Fajardo. And there are reasons why one could see that happening. But at this point, there's still, in great Colombian political tradition, a lot of deal making to be done, because clearly, if it happens, I would think particularly on the right, I can't imagine
Alvaro Uribe, who's still a bit of a kingmaker, maybe not exactly the way he was, but still. Can't imagine him wanting De Aspriella going with someone who comes out of that primary of someone else on the right and having the right vote split. But who knows? Fajardo has said there's no way he's going into that consulta in the center. Still has post-traumatic stress syndrome from when he did it 4 years ago, felt that he was badly treated and it didn't work to his advantage. But he's still open to the idea of maybe working with somebody or having some conversations after the first round. So we'll see. There's still more deal making to be had. The final point I would make, which is a point I guess I alluded to earlier, look, there are three things really in Colombia. Security is number one. And anecdotal evidence on my own conversations with people I know. I've had conversations with people who voted for center-left Fajardo the last time and are going all the way to Aspriella this time because of the security issue, right? So I have to see how that plays out. And healthcare is an issue, as is pension reform. There are other issues, but those are the ones that people are really, really upset about, particularly health, the way it's been handled by the current government. In terms of Venezuela, as I said earlier, we're just going to have to see how that plays out, right? Because people on the right, particularly some in the center, are selling their proximity to Trump's people. In fact, one was a former ambassador to the U.S., a former defense minister, and we're going to have to see how that works, right?
And I invite you all to follow our series on the Colombian Center to listen to further analysis and evaluation of the elections coming up. We have two more areas that I don't want to be remiss to not mention. So Eduardo, can I have you give a very quick overview of Peru? And then I'm going to come to Eric very quickly, just a couple of comments on the Caribbean, and then we'll do a final question to all the panelists.
Of course. Peru is a strange country, even by Latin American standards. Eric alluded at the beginning that successful countries rely on institutions, not heroes. And I think Peru has one very important characteristic. Within Latin America, it's not Chile, where almost every aspect of institutions means that Chile will be fairly predictable and well-run on almost every aspect. Peru has among the more developed and successful economic institutions of any country in Latin America. And I think that's an anchor that has kept the country running well, despite the turmoil of Peruvian politics. There's a joke within Peruvians that probably the most dangerous job in the planet is to being a Peruvian president, because there's essentially none left who are, no former presidents who are either alive and out of jail. So Peru manages to work despite its politics. But there's also another thing about Peru which is curious. If you look at the developed countries around the world, all except 1.5 are parliamentary regimes, not presidential regimes. The US is presidential, France is kind of a hybrid, but there's something about it about a parliamentary regime that tends to lead to good outcomes, and I think it has to do with accountability of politics. John said that Milei has been successful despite not having political force because Main Street has been happy with him. And I think Peru is migrating to a form of parliamentary system despite itself. There's no political parties left in Peru. The APRA used to be the only party. It doesn't exist anymore. And you basically have a coalition of politicians who are all one-off. So it's almost like a ultra-parliamentary regime in the sense that you have to keep people happy or you're out of a job. And as long as the economic continuity of the economic policy establishment of Peru remains in place, I think Peru is one of those countries which I'm fairly comfortable with because of that capacity to kick out any leader which runs afoul of Main Street and the economic continuity that the country has embedded in itself.
Yeah, so on the Caribbean, a vast region, but I would point out a number of factors. Number one, the Caribbean suffered a lot during COVID with the decline in tourism, and that's still not fully where it should be. Secondly, there is a need for a different type of economic model. Tourism has pretty low multiplier effects. It doesn't have a lot of the benefits that you would get from a more manufacturing sector. On the other hand, I would say that policy making in the region has become more sophisticated. You saw a major hurricane devastate parts of the Caribbean last fall, but Jamaica had importantly purchased a natural disaster bond, which was something that was an important use of a financial risk tool, partly supported by the multilateral development banks, but had that in place. And while it wouldn't cover everything that would need to be done, there is a sense that it's not just a hurricane and then everything has to be picked up from the beginning. You have actually a financial foundation with the payout from that allows the country to have at least some funds to rebuild. And so that's something in the age of climate change that's very important for the Caribbean. And I would look to see how interesting financial tools could be applied to manage risk elsewhere. Another key, I think, area will be what is the future of Trinidad and Tobago. You've seen obviously declines in natural resource production, particularly oil. And so you're looking at an example of a post-petroleum future to some extent, and all of the spin-offs that come from that. And so obviously deep expertise that in terms of engineering and the development of specialized equipment and services and so on that exist in Trinidad. And so I'm thinking about how you use those assets in the future. And then finally, one of the least discussed and potentially interesting developments from the events in Venezuela is what happens to Guyana, because you've had obviously a significant pressure put from time to time from Venezuela on Guyana with claims. And now that there's oil involved, that's something that's extremely important. So perhaps if the US is successful in exerting some influence, that may discourage more extreme elements on the nationalist side from pursuing shifts in jurisdiction and borders of some of the oil producing regions in Guyana. So much to watch, but I think the Caribbean is advancing in certain positive directions, but fundamentally looking at how do you build a different type of economy is something that will continue to be an urgent priority.
Great. I think we have one final question for everybody. If you want to make a very, very quick comment on if you have one thought that you would want everybody to walk away with on the region, whether here or across the region. Start with you, Eduardo.
Okay, I'll kind of cheat and summarize a lot of the points others made, which I think are very important and were not emphasized enough. I think, as John said, there's probably going to be a region-wide series of tariffs imposed on China. I think that's going to be one of the themes for all of Latin America and the Americas going forward. China has, over the last few decades, become the manufacturing center of the world, and that leads to shift in even how real estate works in countries. When countries are industrializing, you have small cities springing up because you don't build factories in downtown cities. You build them in suburbs, you build them in small cities. This change in the way people deal with China is probably going to lead to a reindustrialization of the Americas. We're going to see small cities, I think, across the Americas start to thrive, and that's going to have implications for asset prices, for the evolution of cities, etc. That also has implications for Latin America as a whole. An industrializing region needs resources. And when we have seen periods like this exist, let's say the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, Latin America does really well in those periods. It's usually the periods in time where you have golden ages in the region. So I think it's going to be a challenging few years, probably around 10 years of of challenges, and we have to adapt to this new system. But I actually think the outlook for Latin America is going to be quite interesting. And for Canada, there's another element which is very important, which is the demographics of Canada and Latin America match each other really well. Canada is a country that's aging. Latin America is a country that has about 20 years left of still demographic boom. The pension systems of the two, of Canada and Latin America, are good complements for each other. There'll probably be asset selling by Canadian investors over the next few years and asset buying by Latin American countries over the next few years because of demographics. So I think we're going to have a very interesting couple of decades.
In spite of what I said about Lula and Brazil, the fact is that the first thing we got to stop doing is watching U.S. news about Latin America, because the fact is that politics in Latin America, like everywhere in the world, as Tip O'Neill said, is local. And if you want to understand what's going on in Latin America politically, it's not very little to do with Washington. It has to do with the fact that the last time the region was hit universally by one external factor, that was COVID. And the way Latin America reacted to COVID was very strict quarantines that took 30 years of progress of reducing the extremes of wealth in Latin America, and it poof disappeared in 10 months, and we lost 15 years of progress of income distribution. Why? Because everyone in this room who their equivalent in Latin America in terms of professional class people were able to pivot from going to the office to working from home on Zoom. Meanwhile, 70% of the economy made up of people who work informally. Their incomes went from 100 to 0. That created such animosity against the political establishment that we had 7 populists running the 7 largest economies in Latin America in 2023. What we proved was that populism doesn't make for good economic policy. Thankfully, the institutions held up, and we are now seeing a political shift back towards not just to the right, but towards a more technocratic, pragmatic form of governance. And the name of the game in Latin America for the next 3 years will be deregulation. It's not just Latin America. It's going on in Canada. It's going on in Europe. Deregulation combined with more governments that are set on reducing costs rather than raising taxes is going to be a big uplift in Latin America economically over the next 3 to 4 years. And that, I think, is going to be a positive story that perhaps is lost in the weeds when we're talking about snatching presidents in the dead of night or what might happen in Cuba next. Economies that, by the way, don't matter to you guys. Venezuela and Cuba matter 0 economically in Latin America. They matter a lot politically, they matter a lot socially and personally, but not economically, and certainly not for Canadian exporters. So focus on what's important.
Thank you. Very briefly, just, yeah, I agree with this last comment of John. But I think they matter ideologically, and we should be careful with that because in the case of, for example, Mexico, we have been seeing the Mexican government playing with the idea of defending Venezuela, but also getting in good terms with the United States. It is going to be very conflicting in the coming months, especially with the USMCA review or renegotiation or whatever it will be. But I think we should be careful. And my point as an end comment, what is happening not just in the region, but in the entire world is a shift, yeah, but my concern is that even governments that might have the logic and the economic arguments to be in power, they are running to the populist and nationalistic narratives when they see their political proposals in danger. So we need to be very careful because it is very easy for them to change politics, to change policies, just because they want to win an election and want to stay in power. And in Latin America, we have seen that in the last decades, and it happens very quickly. And the change from from the left and to the right is very easy, but also it is very easy to go from the democratic governments to dictatorships. And we have seen how it might end, and Venezuela is an example. And final thought, I promise. Venezuela's change is, we need to stop thinking on Venezuela as a regime change. It will change in the matter of it's convenient for the people that it is in power. And remember that people that it is in power now, it is still part of the Maduro regime. Nothing changed. It is exactly the same people. The only thing that have changed is that they are now frightened of being out of power because of Trump, and they are going to respond to that threat. But for Venezuelans, it might be exactly the same, and that's why we don't see Venezuelans chanting and doing a lot of party because of what is happening now.
Eric, before we go to you, Gustavo is still with us. Gustavo.
But what I wanted to say first is what John said about politics in Latin America being local. It's music to my ears as someone who produces news about Latin America for foreigners. But I think that this is a moment of with a lot of signals of optimism in Brazil. We have seen a tax reform that is about to be implemented. We have given accountability to coup mongers, and we are opening ourselves more to trade. So even if the scenario has a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot to be optimistic about.
Thank you. Eric, and then we'll finish off with Jonathan, please.
Yeah, so I want to talk about Canada and Kuzma. Fundamentally, the other countries of the world, the Japanese, the Europeans, and everyone except China have negotiated and agreed to radically asymmetrical trade agreements where a European good coming to the US pays 15% tariff and a US good going to their market pays nothing. This will not work in Canada where you're less than a 2-hour drive from here to Buffalo. And so Mark Carney is attempting to negotiate the hardest trade agreement that any country has attempted to negotiate with the US. It wants something that is genuinely reciprocal. And the USMCA Kuzma agreement provides a foundation for that, but we should not take it lightly about how challenging this will be, because all of the vaunted great trading nations of Europe and Asia outside of China have essentially surrendered to US terms.
I'm going to try to take a even higher altitude perspective and think about the world we're in and what does it need. And I very much agree with Eduardo. You know, in certain eras in history is when Latin America really has stepped forward. You know, my grandfather used to tell me that the expression in Montreal in the late 1920s for a rich person was an Argentine. And there's a reason for that, because it was a time when everybody was doing two things. They were building and then they were rearming. And that's exactly what our world is doing now. It is rearming and it is building. You can't swing a cat without a politician saying it's time for us to build and not to watch and not to fight, but to build. And of course, that's absolutely the case here in Canada. So building things needs stuff to build from. And that's what they've got in Latin America. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. So I'm very bullish in terms of that. I can't, speak on the finer points of whether that will be a particularly glorious age of democracy or a glorious age of fairness, but it would be prosperity.
Well, my final thought would be several thoughts, I suppose, is I would not, and sort of echoing a little bit of what was said here, although I would probably put a slightly different spin on it, but I would not interpret, for example, the election results in Colombia that are coming up, perhaps even Brazil, I'm not sure, as some referendum as to whether or not the hemisphere is turning right or left. I don't subscribe to that. I didn't subscribe to it several decades ago when they talked about the pink tide. I think it really depends on the dynamics in each country. There are some similarities, but I think the differences override in my analysis. My one takeaway is a little bit more prosaic. I think it's going to be interesting to watch the development of the relationship between Mark Carney and Lula. There have been any number of very warm tweets, particularly from Lula, about Mark Carney. When the G7 happened, there were several then. That just recently, they just met. Lula once again invited, well, according to Lula's tweet, Mark Carney to Brazil. And according to Lula's tweet, Mark Carney accepted, and it's supposed to happen in the springtime. The statement from Mark Carney's office didn't quite go that far, but there has been a lot, there's an apparent warmth between the two who believe that they can collaborate on a number of issues. And so I think if Mercosur is just being one, but I do think that if we watch that and if there's a greater proximity between the two countries, which had a very rocky relationship through their history, it never was on great terms. This bridging could be very significant, certainly for Canada. I would like to think for Brazil as well. So I would keep an eye on that.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists, Jonathan, Eric, Solange, John, Eduardo, and Gustavo from Brazil. Thank you all for those of you here in the room. Thank you to Faskins and, of course, our annual sponsors. We'll see you again soon.